Who was James Wardrop? James Wardrop was born on the 14th of August 1782 at Torbanehill in Bathgate. He was the youngest son of James Wardrop and his wife, Christian Marjoribanks, sister of the first provost of Bathgate, Alexander Marjoribanks.
His mother, Christian, was the sister of Alexander Marjoribanks, the first provost of Bathgate. She died in 1784 when James was 2 years old.
He studied at St Andrews University. In 1800s he was apprenticed to a leading firm of surgeon apothecaries, which included Benjamin Bell, James Russell and his great-uncle Andrew Wardrop. He further studied moral philosophy under Dugald Stewart, and as a member of the Students' Academic Society, befriended David Brewster, who later became principal of St Andrews and Edinburgh Universities. He then sailed to London in 1802, where Astley Cooper and John Abernethy taught him at Guy's and St Thomas's hospitals. Following this, he made his way to Paris during the respite and hostilities afforded by the Peace of Amiens. However, soon after his arrival, he was interned by Napoleon's troops, but made his escape bearing a false passport in the name of an American merchant. He travelled to Germany and Austro-Hungary, learning the new surgical techniques in Vienna and Berlin before returning home. During his time in Europe, he also added to his collection of minerals. He became a member of the Royal College of Surgeons and was appointed to a post at the Pathological Museum. He was in practice with his uncle and also at the Royal Public Dispensary. During this time he published essays on the morbid anatomy of the human eye and his work on the retinoblastoma entitled Observation on the Fungus Hematodes. He had difficulties in finding opportunities for developing his own clinical practice in Scotland and so moved to London in 1809. There, his practice and reputation grew steadily, and he became a member of the Royal College of Surgeons of London in 1814. In London, he established himself in practice in St James and continued to publish case reports and a second volume of essays on the morbid anatomy of the human eye. He did not hold an appointment at the major teaching hospitals. However, he founded the West London Surgical Hospital off Edgware Road in 1826, a voluntary hospital giving free treatment to the poor. Here, he lectured and demonstrated surgical techniques to interested students and practitioners. These practical courses were very popular. Dozens of physicians and surgeons, including several from Europe, attended the weekly demonstrations in the hospital's amphitheatre to see Wardrop operate. Eventually, he also lectured on surgery at St Bartholomew's Hospital and at the Great Windmill Street School of Medicine. Wardrop married Margaret, daughter of Colonel George L. Dalrymple and widow of Captain Byrne, on the 15th of June 1814. They had 4 sons and a daughter. 3 of their sons were called George Dalrymple Wardrop, James John Marjoribanks Wardrop, and Hugh Dalrymple Hamilton Wardrop. Wardrop published on aneurysm and its cure by a new operation in 1828. The book included sections devoted to the pathology of aneurysms, the techniques that Hunter and Brasdor had developed to treat them, and the surgical approach which Wardrop had devised to attempt to cure them. Although Wardrop advocated surgical treatment for aneurysms, he acknowledged that many of the aneurysms were in locations that were inaccessible. His innovation was to ligate the branches of a diseased vessel branching from the aneurysm, in an attempt to reduce the flow of blood through the aneurysm. This in turn would favour the development of thrombus within the aneurysm, thereby diminishing the risk of rupture or progressive expansion, paving the way for modern treatments of the condition. Wardrop emphasised the importance of accurate diagnosis. The diagnosis of diseases may be considered as the stepping stone to their treatment. Although Wardrop was not a strong supporter of auscultation, he believed the procedure could help a physician make the correct diagnosis. At a time when many prominent clinicians still debated the value of the stethoscope, which was only introduced a generation earlier by Linnaeus, Wardrop told his readers, "Notwithstanding all that may be said against auscultation, we ought not deny the utility of the information to be derived from it." Wardrop was frustrated at the state of therapeutics and contended that the advances of the treatment of heart disease were not at all commensurate with the progress of physiological and pathological science. His approaches to treatment reflected both a utility of late 18th and early 19th century views on the pathophysiology of heart disease. Wardrop published a book on bloodletting in 1835, and his monograph, published 16 years later, revealed a continued enthusiasm for the practice. Bloodletting may be considered one of the most valuable curative means in the treatment of diseases of the heart. There is almost no malady to which the heart is liable, wherein bloodletting is not useful during at least some period of its progress. Although many leading clinicians of Wardrop's era shared in his enthusiasm for bloodletting, the popularity of the procedure was declining steadily. Wardrop discussed diseases of the various tissues of the heart in his comprehensive 587-page book. Referring to coronary artery disease, what today we know as heart disease, he explains, "When the coats of the coronary arteries are diseased, it must often happen that the heart, not being supplied with its wonted quantity of blood, its muscles become pale and flaccid, and unfit to carry on vigorously the circulation, and consequently arise an assemblage of symptoms, to which the name of angina pectoris has been given." Here, Wardrop is describing the progression of both angina and ultimately heart attacks. Much like his contemporaries of the time, Wardrop did not attribute angina exclusively to coronary artery disease. Although acute myocardial infarction, also known as a heart attack, was not recognised as a distinct syndrome until the early 20th century, Wardrop did link myocardial dysfunction to coronary artery disease.
He presented a copy of his On Aneurysm and its Cure to the University of St Andrews, dedicated as, "From the author to James Simpson, MD, it is a particular pleasure to me to think that it should have been on the same spot of that land as yourself, wherein I drew my first breath of life."
In his private practice, he became familiar with and drew the attention of the staff to the Prince Regent at nearby Carlton House, and through this and knowledge of horses dating from his childhood, he came to the attention of the court officials.
One of the horses of the Prince of Wales was seized with a violent attack of ophthalmia, which baffled the skill of the veterinary surgeons. Lord Queensberry was commanded to consult the first surgeon oculist in London. He called upon his fellow countryman, Wardrop, who at the time had a reputation of being a skillful oculist. He was successful in treating the horse and advanced to become surgeon extraordinary to the Prince Regent in 1818.
He was appointed an extraordinary surgeon to the Prince Regent just before the death of George III, and continued in this office with the newly crowned King George IV. He travelled with the King on his visit to Edinburgh in 1822, when they became more closely acquainted. He taught at the Aldersgate School of Medicine and later lectured in anatomy and surgery at the Windmill School and published work on the treatment of aneurysm by distal ligation. Wardrop was an outspoken and critical man. He antagonised senior members of the London medical establishment, who were also influential members of the King's Circle. He played an active part in successfully opposing restrictive practices in medical education on the part of the Royal College of Surgeons of England. George IV's lifestyle was anything but healthy, and his illnesses worsened until his death in 1830. His close medical advisors, particularly Sir William Knighton, excluded Wardrop from attending him in his last illness, and he became even more embittered.
Over time, George IV had high opinion of Wardrop and made a special appointment for him in becoming surgeon to the king. When King George IV fell ill for the last time, it is said that James Wardrop was commanded to attend Windsor on Sunday the 25th of April, 1830. When on entering the king's bedchamber, Wardrop found His Majesty sitting alone upon a couch. After Wardrop examined the king's chest, George IV said to Wardrop, "Tell me, my good friend, what you think, really and truly, is the matter with me, for I'm much more serious than Knighton either thinks or chooses to tell me." James Wardrop then stated that the difficulty in breathing arose entirely from an impediment of the circulation of the blood through the heart. His Majesty followed with, "Tell me, Wardrop, honestly, if you think I shall recover." Wardrop replied that his condition was by no means hopeless, though His Majesty must be perfectly aware that any disease of a vital organ like the heart could not be altogether free of danger. Wardrop stated in writing that his opinion of the affection of the heart might be dependent on an arthritic diathesis, and that if, by the treatment suggested, the gout could be brought to manifest itself in the limbs, the king might be relieved. After his visit to Windsor, his attendance there was terminated, and later learned that the king had repeatedly expressed a wish to see him, and his surprise at his never having returned to the palace.
After the late king's death, in amongst these tensions, Wardrop was associated with Thomas Wakeley in the founding of The Lancet, a British medical journal, in 1823, for which he first wrote savage articles and, later, witty and scurrilous lampoons in his column Intercepted Letters. The letters were under the pseudonym Brutus. These letters were thinly disguised as have been written by leading London surgeons, and particularly of the late king's doctors, containing scurrilous comments on one another. Here Wardrop reveals their nepotism, venality and incompetence. There was enough truth in them to make the parodies sting, and thus further antagonising his contemporaries. Wardrop was revealed as the true author, and he was further alienated. Unfortunately for Wardrop, during these dramas, his continued support of bloodletting as a mode of treatment when it had already been discredited was detrimental to him. Nonetheless, he published a book entitled On the Nature and Treatment of the Diseases of the Heart in 1837. His compatriot from West Lothian, Robert Liston, on moving from Scotland to London, complained that Wardrop blocked him out of practice with the Scottish nobility. His practice further declined, and he became even more embittered. James Wardrop took an early interest in applying the emerging principles of pathology to enhance the understanding of eye disease in the early years of the 19th century. He described keratic precipitates and coined the term keratitis, as well as classifying the retinoblastoma as a malignant tumour. His management of sympathetic ophthalmitis and attribution of corneal edema to raised intraocular pressure have further added to his reputation as the father of ophthalmic pathology. His contribution to the understanding of ophthalmic pathology helped to reclassify inflammation of the eye, Up until this point, it was referred to as ophthalmia, whatever the cause, and his recognition that early excision would improve the prognosis in retinoblastoma, the malignant tumour of the retina occurring in childhood, has since been implemented. His observations on the management of perforating injuries of the globe in horses led to the treatment by early evisceration or inoculation in humans and provided the only treatment to avoid blindness for the succeeding 100 years. Considering the primitive instruments and illumination available to him, his contributions to the advancement of ophthalmic clinical practices were unmatched. He had studied drawing in Edinburgh and knew David Wilkie and Andrew Geddes from school days. At one time, his collection contained the works of Correggio, Rubens, Quipp, Tiepolo, Gainsborough, Turner, and Wilkie, and on the formation of the National Gallery of Scotland in 1850, he donated 2 paintings which remain in the collection.
He had a divergent squint in his left eye and eventually went blind in the 1850s. During his final years he was living alone and only attended by a 72-year-old housekeeper and 2 young servants.
After his difficulties with the London medical community, he became reclusive for several years, but would entertain his old friends who visited him. He died in Charles Street, off St James Square in London, on the 13th of February 1869. After his death in his London home, he was taken back to Scotland and was buried in Bathgate Old Kirk cemetery, near his mother's ancestral burial place, in accordance with his wishes.